Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish here, and we are in week 4, which means we're going to go over today chapters 7 and 8 in our Discovering Literature textbook. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Cengage handbook for the first time, and I do want to do a couple of brief housekeeping things with you all. So if you've been in the course for now 3 to 4 weeks, there are a couple places each week that you should be going to. I'm sure that you are because you have found this video. The first, and I am in student mode, so I see our class exactly like you see it, is make sure that you check out the announcements and the handouts each week. So for example, in handouts, we're in week 4. So you'll notice that for week 4, we have this presentation that I am about to go over, and you can click on it and download it here. I've also put up a sample short story, so I'm going to try to find an analysis of regular short story too, but this is a more creative writing example. So if you're doing the creative writing options 1 through 4 for paper 1, you can check out the story as an example that was done fairly well. I think there were some grammar errors in it, but this was her draft that she submitted a few years ago, and I liked the short story, so I kept it to show you guys. And then also make sure to check the announcements. I'll be posting the link to this week 4 video here. You can subscribe on YouTube to Professor Parish, and that way you'll see the videos as soon as they come out. You won't have to wait till each week, but you can view it there. And then also, if you're trying to check and see what assignments are due each week, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can either click the weekly assignments, the course content, and of course our discussion forum. There's a discussion almost every week, so you can view those. For me personally, I would look at course content and discussion forum together. If I click on the weekly assignments, it does tell me what is due this week, and it gives me some links to those assignments. But let me show you how course content sets it up, because it's essentially the same information, just distributed in a different way. So if I go to course content instead of weekly assignments, it will show me what's due next, but also if I scroll down, it will show me week 3, which we are in now. As I create this video, it will show me what is due each week, the due dates, and there's a little checkbox by it. So week 4 also shows what to do. But if I go back to week 2, for example, if the item is checkboxed, that means it's submitted and it's done. But if you don't see that checkbox on the screen, that means it's not been submitted. So you'll know, oh, okay, I haven't submitted this assignment. I still need to do this. So that is a helpful tool to keep you on top of your assignments. And I just really like how course content sets it up. And then you can always click to close here, and it minimizes that week that's already done. So if I were you and I was checking my assignments each week, I would look at course content and then obviously the discussion forum to do my posts. But you can use weekly assignments, but I just don't like the layout of it as much as course content, and I don't think it's as helpful in making sure you remember what you've done and what you haven't done for the class than doing the course content tab. Okay, as always, you can email me and ask me questions, but I just want to give everybody a reminder and a heads up. So let's start in on our PowerPoint for this week. So, prose, style, and theme. Unlike week 3, my presentation is actually created ahead of time, so I do apologize for last week being a little impromptu. But this week, everything's sorted out. We have a nice, wonderfully blue PowerPoint to go through. So we're actually on the last 2 elements of fiction, which I'm pretty excited about. And I think of all the elements of fiction, theme and style are the most subjective, and that it really depends on you, the author, what you create and what you put in as your theme and style. So on page 261, we have this nice image of footprints in the sand to start us off on theme, which I think ties well in terms of meaning when we look at things in terms of stories, purpose as well. So on page 261, they talk about what theme means. It's basically the purpose or meaning of a story. And with that, I put these questions too. So when you are a writer, you need to ask, what are your readers going to take from your story? Is it supposed to be funny? Is it supposed to be a lighthearted, humorous little caricature or vignette of an event that's happened? Is it supposed to be a serious piece that they're supposed to feel an emotional weight towards? What is at stake for the readers? What should they take away from it? Do you want them to learn anything? The nice thing about theme is you can make it as simple or as complex as you want. If you want readers to learn something, you need to kind of outline that ahead of time in your story. And then what is the overall impression you want them to have? Are you aiming for shock value? Do you want them to read your story and be shocked and surprised, like Chuck Palahniuk does with his second person point of view? He's going for that. That's the theme. He wants you to feel uncomfortable. Or do you want their overall impression to be that of a positive, uplifting expression where they leave the story feeling really good about themselves? Or do you want to bring out an existential crisis and point out something that's maybe dystopian or wrong in the system or society and have readers feel like they need to question things after reading the story, much like the book 1984 does? So it really depends on what your goals are as a writer, but your story needs to have a meaning or a purpose. Otherwise, your readers are going to encounter it and not know what the whole point of reading the story was. And that's what you don't want. You don't want a reader to feel like they've wasted their time. All right. So with that being said, there are 3 things that you need to watch out in terms of theme, and they're all connected to one another. The first is large abstractions, meaning you don't want things to be too vague. You don't want the reader to not understand what the point of the story was. When you're trying to be too broad or encompassing too many themes at once, your reader might be confused and not know what the whole point of the story is or what your actual purpose was. And you don't want that. You don't want to be too vague in what the meaning of the story is. In the same vein, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, you don't want to be oversimplified. You don't want to treat your audience, especially if it's an adult audience, like they're dumb. You don't want to treat them like they can't understand what the theme is. So you don't want it to be so simple that your audience is like, oh, that was it? Oh, it's just that? Okay. You don't want them to have that feeling like the meaning was just too simplified. And also in that same vein, you don't want to be cliche. And cliche is very similar to archetypes, which we talked about with characters. Cliches are just exhausted, overused stereotypes or tropes, which are connecting elements in a story. So the whole good versus evil, that is a very cliche theme. Or love triumphs all. It's a little bit cliche because it's been done over and over again. So if authors decide to go with a theme that's like that, they try to change it up or incorporate something fresh to make audiences not feel like they've seen this same meaning over and over again. If you are thinking in your head as you're reading, oh, I know what this is about, I've seen this message, it's probably cliche. So you just want to avoid these 3 things in your themes. Now for our paper 1, it's a short story or it's an analysis of a paper, so you don't have to worry about this so much as if you were in a creative writing class, but there's still things to watch out for. So if you're writing an analysis of a paper or analysis of a short story for paper 1, you might analyze the theme and say, okay, were there any large abstractions? Was it oversimplified? Were there cliches? Or was it fresh and different? So those are just 3 things to watch out for. Long story short, pardon the pun, is that theme's a delicate balance. It's not as easy as it sounds. And the big thing is to know your audience. Know who's going to read the papers that you write. So for example, in this class, we pretty much have our audience narrowed down. And it's pretty easy. Your audience is myself, the instructor, and your fellow classmates. So you know what your audience is expecting. This paper has a general theme. It's about fiction or nonfiction. The challenge, you can challenge yourself with a theme. You can keep it simplistic. You can make it just about this versus that. You just need to make sure that you are understanding who's going to read this paper and what are they expecting. Maybe you're going to do some shock value in your paper, and that's fine, but you don't want to go too off the wall because it is a college class. It needs to be appropriate for a college course and instruction, but you can still have fun with it and play around with it because your audience are adults. We're all out of high school, in college. For most part, there are some high school students in here, so keep that in mind, especially when we get to our later papers. But this is a college course, so you can be a little bit more independent with your theme of your paper. All right. So then, chapter 8, like I said, in the very first video we did, this book is mostly stories, mostly example texts. So we will jump around quite a bit. When we get into some of our later genres like drama and poetry, we'll spend a little bit more time with the examples they give us in the book. But for fiction, a lot of these stories are just kind of as examples to help you learn from as you're writing your own paper. And in the case of Hemingway, which we will talk about during this chapter, we get to read some work in the chapters that kind of emphasize the elements we're looking over. So chapter 8 actually starts on page 308 and has a very scary clown lady or clown man, I think it's a man, at the start, looking extremely happy and or scary. I don't like clowns. But it's a stylistic choice, right? Connects. So style is basically how an author uses language to create his or her reality. Style is the most subjective element of fiction because you can go so many places with it. We're reading for week 3 a section of Beautiful Boy and a section of Tweak, two stories that I very, very much enjoyed reading while I was in college. I actually, to give you guys a little bit of background on why I chose those for week 3, in one of my graduate memoir classes, we actually read a lot of memoirs and creative nonfiction. And we split the class into 2 groups. And we all read both books, Tweak and Beautiful Boy. But half of the class read Tweak first, half of the class read Beautiful Boy first. And it was very interesting because depending on what book you read first actually gave that person more of a preference. So, for example, I was in the Tweak group and I read Tweak first. And I did feel in a way that Nick Sheff, who is the author of Tweak, I felt like his account was more authentic than David, the father. But I had a friend in that class that she read Beautiful Boy first and thought that Beautiful Boy was the more truthful version of that text. And it was really interesting to see how our class argued and debated over the truthfulness and honesty of each of those accounts because they are so very different. They're talking about similar events in time, similar situations, but the style is so different. And it was one of those things that you gravitated towards one style or the other. Tweak, as you probably noticed, is very raw. It's organic. It's hardly edited at all. There are grammar mistakes, there's formatting mistakes, the formatting is weird and choppy, and it just looks like somebody's stream of conscious typed everything out very fast. Whereas Beautiful Boy is written by David Sheff, who's a journalist. So you probably noticed in Beautiful Boy there's a lot more lavish language, it's formatted more neatly, he's clearly had an editor look everything over, there's no grammatical errors or spelling errors, and it's organized like you would picture an author or a journalist. It's very traditional in how it's put together, whereas Tweak is much more experimental and avant-garde and abstract in its presentation. And some people like that, and I like that, but some people are like, no, I like David's account better. And it does make a difference. The style does, how you receive a text. So I'm glad that we got to read those 2 versions last week in week 3, because I think that ties in nicely when we start to talk about style here in week 4. You kind of have a background understanding of where I'm coming from there. So style helps to not only make a statement through words, but it sets the mood, it includes detail, and it shows whether the story is going to be in a more traditional, as we know it, format in Western culture versus the more experimental version. So there are types of style that are listed on page 310. These are probably the most defined types of style. And the first is that of an understatement. And that's when an author uses very simplistic words to make a very big point. So if you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is an amazing book, I highly recommend it. It's very weird, and it's kind of revisionist history. It's talking about like aliens with World War II, and it's a weird book. But he keeps repeating this phrase over and over again in the text when something really bad happens. So at one point in the book, Vonnegut's characters are in Germany in an encampment, and there's all of this death and destruction that they see, and the characters just think, so it goes. It's 3 words, but it's such an understatement. They see a massacre, and they just think, so it goes. Like it's just nothing out of the ordinary. And that's such a powerful line because it's understated. You know how much emotional turmoil these characters are facing witnessing this, but they can't describe it. So they just say, so it goes, to give us, the audience, this implication that I really can't talk about this right now. And that's understatement. Something that's very powerful in emotion and theme, but stylistically it's represented in a few short, concise words. It is not to be confused with minimalism, because some students will be like, oh, I was just using understatement, and I'm like, no, you just weren't being very descriptive. So an author really needs to know what they're doing and when to use understatement in order for it to be effective. You don't want your whole story to be stylistically an understatement. You just want to pick out certain parts where you can really punch home and drive home an element or a message with a few words. And if it's done right, it's extremely effective for your audience. The opposite of that, of course, is formal. And a formal style is very, I think of Victorian literature. I think of lavish and rich terminologies and elevated vocabulary and talking about the pretentious facetiousness of characters such and such and such and such. It's just very lavish and elegant and very detailed. Charles Dickens, who was paid by the word to write, which is why his writing is so formal, he used every word he could think of to describe everything, because he knew what he was doing, getting paid by the word, which would be awesome. But yeah, that's the formal style. And then finally we have hyperbole, which is an exaggeration of language to pull an audience in or to draw their attention. And usually you'll see Stephen King use this style. You'll see authors of horror or mystery or suspense fiction or nonfiction. They'll write using hyperbole to kind of exaggerate or draw attention to a moment and keep an audience's attention. So these are 3 main types, and not every story fits into these 3 styles, but they are the most popular and well used. So that's why our textbook includes them here. Our book talks about abstract versus concrete, which will be on your exam for chapter 1, for part 1, fiction and nonfiction. Abstract versus concrete is pretty simple. Concrete is anything that is tangible, that can be felt or seen. So, you know, chairs, hair, the earth, lava, things that you can taste like cookies or vegetables or whatever your senses can encounter, that is concrete. It's real and it's there. Abstract is not tangible or sensory. It's more of an emotion, a thought, or an idea. So examples are freedom, happiness, exhilaration. We can't smell exhilaration. We can't taste freedom. You know, those are concepts. They're ideas. They mean something different to everyone. A cookie is never going to taste like a carrot or a steak. It's always going to have a definitive taste, even if you can tweak around with it. Freedom is going to mean something different to everyone. Happiness is going to mean something different to everyone. There's not a specific example of happiness that is universal. Whereas a chair, aside from being called a different word in a different language, is always going to be a chair, right? It's going to have a basic function and a certain amount of legs and structure to it. So you will be asked to define concrete and abstract and to give examples of it on your exam. 2 other things that we've got are connotation versus denotation. Denotation, I always think denotation dictionary, because a denotation is where it's the dictionary definition or matter-of-fact meaning of a word. And I've got our example of a flag here. Denotation-wise, a flag is just a piece of fabric in a rectangular or square format attached to a wood or metal pole. The connotation, though, is the emotional or symbolic meaning behind that word. And with a flag, depending on what country you're from or what club or organization, that can mean a variety of different things to different people. And that's where the connotation comes in. It's the emotional attachment that we give words, not just the definition. Right? Then we have here literal versus figurative and metaphor versus simile. Whenever someone says that, I always think of Chris Traeger in Parks and Rec, where he's like, I am literally doing this. Literal is grounded in reality. It's real, it's there. Figuratively is implied, but not necessarily real. So somebody says, oh, well, I'm just famished and I'm just skin and bones, figuratively speaking. You're not really skin and bones, but you just feel like it. It's just an implied comparison. And speaking of comparisons, we have metaphor and simile. I believe, in all honesty, that our culture, especially as of late, in the last 10 to 15 years, we have gravitated to the word like so much that similes are easy. A simile is just comparing two or more things with like or as. So think of Dirty Dancing, she's like the wind. Think he's like this, she's as crazy as that. If you can use like or as, which I know you can, similes are easy to come up with. Metaphors are not so much, but they do the same thing. A metaphor and simile are both comparisons of two or more things. A metaphor just does not use like or as. So Shakespeare's famous phrase, all the world is a stage. All the world is a stage. That's a metaphor. And you will be asked on your exam to define both of these and to give an example of each. So be thinking of your metaphors and your similes, because I get a kick out of the examples you guys come up with. All right, dialogue in stories is a form of style. It is entirely stylistic. Your stories that you write, if you choose to write your own piece of creative fiction or nonfiction, this first paper, they don't have to have dialogue if you don't want them. It's completely up to you. However, if you do choose to include dialogue, I've put down here kind of making sure you have the right punctuation. So you want your quotation marks always on the outside of the punctuation. You want your commas and periods on the inside of the quotation marks, unless you're breaking it off here, for example. And then you can pretty much do whatever you want. I also want to point out that I created this little piece of dialogue here, and you can show, don't tell. That's probably the biggest creative writing tip someone will give you, is to show, don't tell. So, for example, hello, she waved to him. Oh, he stammered, nearly dropping his books. Hey. I don't ever say it, but what emotion do you think this guy is feeling? We have that he stammered, that's the verb. He nearly drops his books. So you can probably imply that one of two different emotions are happening. Either he's nervous or surprised because he wasn't expecting her to be there, or he's nervous because she's there. And that can be for a number of reasons. But we can get all these different implications from their conversation without them telling us at all. And that's kind of what you want to do in a story. You don't want to specifically lay out, she was feeling sad. Why did we know she was feeling sad? What made you think that? So if I had put, her head was hung low when she slowly looked up to him. Hello, she waved. That has a whole different meaning than just she waved to him. Now her head's hung, she's slowly rising up, she's lethargic. That creates a whole nother set of emotions that weren't there when I just said she waved to him. So it could have a huge impact on how your audience views your text. So that is something to keep in mind too. The language you attach to these verbs here will make a difference in what you write and how your readers are impacted by it. All right, so we're going to get into some examples now, which I'm pretty excited about. The first ones here are with parallelism and sentimentality. So with parallelism, we have a repetition of grammatical elements, creating a rhythm and building emotion to hammer home a point. So there's repetition at the start and ending of different things. And then we have sentimentality, which is deliberately making an audience feel sadness or pity for a character. So these two can often be hand in hand. There can be a parallelism in a story and sentimentality, but they can also be separate. So, for example, for parallelism, I mentioned last week Grave of the Fireflies, which is a very sad film. And Grave of the Fireflies, this whole thing here actually runs both parallelism and sentimentality. but it's mainly parallelism. On this side here, this is the start of the movie. This character is our main guy here, and this is basically his soul. He basically sees himself die in the first 5 minutes, so no spoiler warning. He dies in the first 5 minutes of the movie, and then we spend the whole movie following how he got from point A to where we start at point B with him dying. So at the beginning we see this opening shot of him dying, and then it's immediately followed by this little girl. And that's the opening credits of the film. Well, the story ends, we're right back to where we started with the young man dying, and then we see him and the little girl together at the end. And you find out through the movie who the little girl is and what the story behind her is, but it's a very nice example of parallelism in that it starts and ends kind of on the same note. But we, the audience, have been through so much with these characters from this point to that point that the ending has a whole new context that the beginning did not. So that's a good example of parallelism. And it's also sentimentality, because you're meant to feel pity and sadness for these characters. But John Wick is straight up sentimentality, because he has his little dog here at the beginning after he loses his wife. And we find out what happens to the dog, and it's basically meant for us to feel sad for him and to feel empathy and pity for him as well. And I believe it accomplishes its goal. If you've not seen John Wick, it's a good example. This is another example here. We reevaluate irony in this chapter. And I actually really like this definition for irony in chapter 8. They reevaluate it to encompass a sad and comic contrast between expectation and reality. And I think the most perfect example of this is found in 500 Days of Summer, which came out several years ago. But if you've not seen 500 Days of Summer, there is a moment. It's told from Joseph Gordon-Levitt, the actor. It's told from his point of view, and he's had this relationship with this girl, Summer, and they kind of reach a part where they break apart. They break up. And he's invited to a housewarming party of hers, and he has in his head how this housewarming party is going to go. And so we see on one hand of the screen what he expects to happen, and on the other side of the screen we see what reality is. And it's a really cool example of the filmmaker or author using style in this case, because they show side by side these two, this irony. And we're going to watch it real quick. It's not too long, but hold on. Okay, so we're going to watch this scene.
Nice. You're tired. Good. So nice. Thank you. You should have. That's so nice. So Tom, what is it that you do?
I write greeting cards.
Tom could be a really great architect if he wanted to be.
That's unusual. I mean, what made you go from one to the other?
I guess I just figured, why make something disposable like a building when you can make something that lasts forever, like a greeting card? What?
No one's got it all. No one's got it all. Love's the beat we don't want. We want pleasure, and it's even try to rape us, and I guess that they're succeeding. And we're going to
Love how it fades away.
We're not doing any meeting, and we're trying to be faithful, but we're cheat. I'm the hero of the story. I don't need to be saved. I'm the hero of the story. start. Don't need to slow. It's alright.
So basically, we see in that stylistic moment the character of Joseph Gordon-Levitt go from his expectation versus reality to reality sinking in and overlapping with expectation. And I think it's stylistically really well done. It's probably my favorite part of the whole movie. And then he talks to her afterwards, and you'll have to watch the video to find out more. But even at the end, his character is obsessed with architecture, as you see in the video, with little subtle hints. And at the end, everything's kind of scribbled away. And that's kind of a stylistic choice by the filmmaker to represent kind of his architectural-oriented mind. So really like that example. But I think Chapter 8 in our book does a good job of explaining irony, in a sense. It'll go back when we get to poetry and drama and give us more definitions, but for now I really like the way they define it here in Chapter 8. And then we have also looking at postmodernism on page 315, and postmodernism is basically a style of writing where it exactly understands what it is. It knows that it's a romance novel, or it knows it's an action story or science fiction, because when you think about it, texts used to be, Victorian literature didn't call itself Victorian literature, it was just literature. But the way that we have developed our genres of literature, the way we've kind of categorized and labeled different things, postmodernism is sort of a way of recognizing that. Authors recognize what they're writing for. And it's a little bit cynical, and it's a little bit sarcastic. We look at things through a more jaded lens, perhaps, than looking at story just as a story. We know what category it fits into. And we're going to be looking for reading response too, and for some of our later discussion forums, looking at literature, different genres, and kind of comparing and contrasting those. So postmodernism is, I think, really popular now. When you think of movies and books that break the fourth wall, like Deadpool, those are very postmodern because they understand what they are. Cabin in the Woods by Joss Whedon is probably one of my favorite Halloween films. I like it because it knows it's a Halloween film. It knows it's a horror movie. So it's kind of fun on our end as the viewer because we're in on the joke. We know exactly what the author is trying to convey. So I like that a lot. And then finally, we have two ending terms here. We have surreal versus abstract versus absurd. And they're very similar. They're a little harder to tell apart because they're very closely connected. The way I would understand it is when something is absurd, it's where there are things in reality that are just out of place. So, for example, a cheeseburger at the bottom of the ocean floor is a little bit absurd. A sponge with pants and a tie on is absurd. There's nothing that's not realistic. You could put pants and a little shirt on a sponge, theoretically, but it's just not something that you expect in the reality that we live in. We don't expect there to be cheeseburgers on the ocean floor. We don't expect fish to have overalls and look like horrible stereotypes of Southern farmers. It's just absurd, right? Surreal is dreamlike, hallucinogenic. It's things that do not make sense and cannot occur in reality. So I use the example from the original Winnie the Pooh, where he has the dream of heffalumps and woozles, which is elephants and weasels. And he has basically an elephant created out of honey pop up. It could not happen in real life. It's dreamlike. It's kind of psychedelic. It's surreal. I think of Dolly. If you're in Art 121, or if you've taken an art class and you've looked at Dolly and he has the melting clocks and the elephants on stilts, that's all surrealist. It's very dreamlike, Alice in Wonderland-esque. Doesn't make sense. Whereas absurd, yeah, you know what a fish is, you know what a hamburger is, you know what a sponge is, and you know what all these elements are, they just don't quite they're not something you would normally see in reality. They're all real, but they're just not put together in a way that is normal. Surreal is just stuff that you can't make that up. It's just very imaginative. All right? And so yeah, that's chapter 7 and 8 in a nutshell. That will be listed on our site. I'm going to post that video up here in the announcements. As far as our Cengage handbook goes, I hope you guys have been at least skimming through and looking over these first couple of weeks when we look at the Cengage handbook. A lot of this text you've probably remembered or read in English 121. So I've not focused too much on it because I know that there probably is just a review for you, which is fine. I do encourage you to look through this textbook because some things may be written differently than what we're used to. And also, I would recommend, if I've been commenting on your posts or on your reading responses or anything like that, that there have been grammatical errors, if I've noted that, I do think it's important to note that there is, in sections 4, 5, and 6 of this text, some really nice sections about grammatical mechanics. And I feel like if you're struggling with commas, I would go to section 5, where it talks about punctuation. I would review over that. I would review over mechanics if you need to. I mean, you do what you've got to do to help yourself. And if you review over these sections and you have any questions, I am always free to ask, and I'm happy to work with you to make sure that you're doing everything right. Okay, we are going to have some grammar checkups throughout the semester, but I'm not going to bombard you with grammar because some of you are doing very well, and I don't want to have us do a ton of grammar assignments if it's not necessary. So make sure you're skimming over this for now. When we get to new parts that I do feel we need to go over, especially MLA, I'm going to touch base on this again. I will have an MLA video out soon. Like I said in the last video, since our paper 1 doesn't necessarily have to have MLA, I'm taking my time with the video, but it will be out soon. We shouldn't have a video next week for week 5, so in week 5 expect an MLA video, and that should be good. As always, if you have questions, let me know, but otherwise, you guys are doing great so far in the class. I look forward to seeing your outlines and reading your papers. Have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll talk to you soon.